You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 17th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme,
we have ministers and prime ministers, very different backgrounds, with one common goal, and that is to make Europe stronger. So, allow me to introduce them.
Introduce them better late than never. Ursula von der Leyen reveals her cabinet of European commissioners. We'll ask what they mean for the direction Europe is headed. From the insiders to the hopefuls, we'll get the latest on a meeting of 6 Western Balkan nations still hoping to join the European Union. After that, we'll get the latest business news. We'll check in on the Booker Prize nominees with Meet the Writers host Georgina Godwin. And finally, right here in London, Monocle's Grace Charlton has been walking the catwalks. Grace, what did you bring us?
I wasn't on the catwalk, but we will discuss the event's 40th anniversary, highlights from the shows, and why London Fashion Week has an edge no other city can pull off.
All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. In Brussels today, at long last, the European Commission's President, Ursula von der Leyen, has named her team of commissioners to run the European Union's executive arm during her second 5-year term in charge. There is something of a palpable shift eastwards on the security front and to the right on the political front. But von der Leyen herself has also vowed that climate change will remain a major focus of her commission. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Nina dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. Good afternoon, Nina.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Always good to have you on a story like this. And I wanted to start with just trying to unpack it a little bit. It is always such an opaque process when it comes to the naming of European commissioners, and this one was especially hard to get to this point. Why was this one so hard?
That's right. Well, you remember that Ursula von der Leyen actually was supposed to unveil this roster of commissioners, 26 of them, just last week, and then it got pushed back another week amid all this furious horse trading. Countries like France had to switch their commissioners to keep their influence around the top table, and a lot of Eastern European countries were given a far more prominent role here. She also managed to make this a slightly more, if not entirely, gender-balanced commission. And she's centralised the power base quite a bit by removing one extra, third layer of vice president. So there's just 2 layers beneath her. And, you know, as you were saying in your introduction there, Chris, this is a reflection that Europe's priorities are changing, especially as the EU confronts new challenges, particularly with regards to security and potentially absorbing in the future big new members like Ukraine.
And it is such a, as you say, horse trading that goes on here. It's a strange process where it's sort of the countries are nominating their commissioners, the governments, but Ursula von der Leyen will negotiate and say yes or no, or which kind of post they will get. So she has a certain amount of power in all of this, obviously, as well. What does that say about her? She was the one who gave the press conference today, of course, unveiling the nominees. But what kind of control do you feel she has over this large group of commissioners and over their strategy?
Well, quite a bit more control than she had 5 years ago, when I remember sitting in Brussels watching her unveil her first college of commissioners. That's what this sort of inner cabinet is officially called. And now, obviously, she's 5 years more experienced into the job. She's had quite a bit of success at managing some really difficult challenges that were unexpected for the EU, notably the pandemic, but also the onset of war in Ukraine, that, as I was saying before, has had to radically re-engineer the EU's thinking on issues that she, as a former German defence secretary, will probably feel very keenly about, notably the issue of security. And what's crucial about looking at the list of priorities here among these commissioner announcements is that you really notice a lot more power has been given to the Baltic states with the announcement, which we already knew about a few months ago, of Kaja Kallas, the former Estonian Prime Minister, as the Foreign Affairs Chief for the EU. The actual title is High Commissioner of Foreign Affairs for the European Union. She's been given that, but also a former Lithuanian Prime Minister, Andrius Kubilius, has been given the crucial defence brief. Now, this is the most important priority for the EU alongside prosperity here. And he's going to be in charge of trying to create some kind of defence union for the EU, which is a thorny subject, and also beefing up defence weaponry production in charge of a budget of 1.5 billion euros.
And it's a new post as well, which is important to say when it comes to the Defence Commissioner. What does that say about the importance that the EU attaches? There is this push and pull between the EU and NATO and its role in Ukraine. Do you get the sense with something like this that this is von der Leyen's way of saying this matters, this is one of our key directions?
It is, absolutely, because remember that on the eastern side of NATO's borders, that also matches the EU's own borders. And there are countries that have been offered potential accession agreements with the EU that are facing their own elections and their own potential interference from Russia just in the next few months. We've got an election taking place in Moldova. We've also got political strife in places like Georgia, countries that after Russia invaded Crimea, so stepped into Ukrainian territory in the first time back in 2015, these countries were immediately sort of brought into the fold. But now the political runes are changing over there in the east, just outside of the EU's borders, but inside what could be future EU's borders and also future NATO borders. So that's a recognition of that. The other issue is that you've got to remember that when it comes to the EU elections, the parliament elections that took place in June, the centre-right, which is Ursula von der Leyen's political home, they did very well. So they've got 14 of these commissioners here. So she is even more powerful, and so is her political creed as well when it comes to making these types of decisions on typical centre-right issues like, for instance, defence and also the economy.
Well, and there are so many different little intricate discussions we could have about different people and countries and how all of this has gone. But one that we did want to focus on, because we did also cover this on the briefing yesterday, is France, because there was this whole battle over the France's commissioner, Thierry Breton, lost his job. And now Emmanuel Macron, the president, has nominated Stéphane Séjourné, and he's going to get a decent post, Commissioner of Industrial Strategy. What does that say about France's role and power between her and Ursula von der Leyen and Macron and all that? That's sort of such an interesting relationship.
Well, a lot of this has focused on Thierry Breton, former French finance minister, I think, if I remember correctly, covering a couple of deals he got involved in about 15 years ago. I think that might have been under Nicolas Sarkozy's time in office. He famously is quite sort of protectionist. He's blocked big French mergers and acquisitions. He's taken to task many US tech giants, notably not being shy of rolling up his sleeves and having a bust up with the likes of Elon Musk online, publicly. And all of this really jars with Ursula von der Leyen's natural sort of conservative, discreet manner of doing politics. And it's become really obvious that this has been irritating her over the last couple of years, especially considering as he also had the brief for the digitisation projects that the EU considered crucial during the last commission and will continue to be crucial. And so what's happened is at the last minute, she's done a switcheroo with Emmanuel Macron and agreed to swap out Thierry Breton with Stéphane Séjourné, who you were saying before is a former French foreign minister. And he's somebody who's probably going to be a lot more discreet and a lot more malleable. And she may feel that that'll get a lot more done at a time when, obviously, remember, we've got a big US election taking place, and those tech giants have been taken to task by the EU Commission with them just having a recent win at the ECJ, European Court of Justice, with regards to their strategy to take on some of these tech titans. They've been vindicated. So she's probably feeling she needs somebody who's a little bit of a more discreet hand politically.
Discreet hand and a former diplomat might help as well. Nino dos Santos, thank you very much for joining us. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Poland's Ministry of Defense has deployed 5,500 soldiers to help with flood relief in the south, including 1,000 in Wrocław, where water levels are expected to peak soon. Military helicopters and engineers are working to strengthen embankments and restore transport. Armed men have attacked a military camp in Mali's capital, Bamako, with state TV calling the attackers terrorists. The situation is now under control. Mali has faced an Islamic insurgency for more than a decade, but it is not clear who is behind the shooting. The U.S. Secret Service is investigating a now-deleted post by Elon Musk suggesting that no one is trying to assassinate President Joe Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris. Musk claimed it was a joke made shortly after an alleged attempt on Donald Trump's life at his Florida golf course, the second such attempt in recent months. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. When it comes to those outside of the European Union, there are a few regions that have been clamoring for entry for longer than the Western Balkans, which, after the admission of Croatia more than a decade ago now, has seen efforts to join stall. Ministers from the 6 countries in the region are meeting in Berlin today to discuss their own halting process of EU integration. And to tell us more, I'm joined now by Guy Delawny, Monocle's Balkans correspondent, joining us from that far-flung Balkan outpost of Tokyo, Japan. Guy, what are you doing over there?
I'm just about to have some food and drink with an old friend who's the other half of Monocle's very own Asia Bureau Chief Fiona Wilson. That's what I'm about to do, and I'm sweating profusely because it's mid-30s in Celsius today, and goodness knows what the humidity rating is, probably about 99%.
You are lucky you're not on TV, Guy, when you say that, but it's
Indeed, I am.
Great that you can be joining us from there. We'll let you get back to your dinner shortly, but we did want to talk about this Berlin process, as it's called. It's the 10-year anniversary of this thing with the Western Balkans. What is it about at this point?
Well, at this point, the Berlin process is, in essence, when we come down to it, it's an effort to keep the Western Balkans countries on side. Because if we're talking about how long it's been taking to get these countries into the European Union, a commitment was made as long ago as 2003. So that's 21 years ago. It was called the Thessaloniki Declaration, made in the Greek city of the same name, where the current member states of the European Union at that time made this declaration, made this commitment. We want the countries of the Western Balkans to join us in the European Union. Well, it's been pathetically slow going, and the Berlin process over the past decade, and it's had its ups and downs in its own right, has been trying to persuade the countries of the Western Balkans that, yes, we really mean it. We really do want you to be doing the things that you need to do to join the European Union. And the key with the Berlin process is that there's money attached to it as well, billions of euros now. Due to a recent commitment about 18 months ago, they decided they were going to splash out multiple billions on these 6 countries if they were making the reforms that would bring them close to the European Union. And these regular meetings that they're having, like this one today in Berlin, it's all part of that. It's all part of saying, don't look elsewhere. Don't look to China. Don't look to Russia. Don't even look to Turkey, which is a strong ally of both Bosnia and Kosovo, for example, but look towards Brussels and the other member states of the European Union.
And tell us more exactly then, Guy, about what Berlin and the EU expect these countries to do. What do they want from them at this point, and are they still inclined to listen?
Well, what they want the countries of the Western Balkans to do varies by country. So, for example, if you were in Montenegro, they want you to sort out the judiciary. With Bosnia-Herzegovina, well, there's the list sort of as long as your arm. It used to be a list of 14 reforms in judiciary, corruption, anti-corruption, I should say, rule of law, all sorts of different areas in Bosnia-Herzegovina that they wanted them to clean up before they got involved in the accession process. Serbia as well, issues with judiciary and media. Kosovo, currently, it's facing problems with the Berlin process due to taking what the European Union has called provocative and unilateral decisions when it comes to the ethnic Serb minority in Kosovo, and causing tensions to rise both within Kosovo and with neighbouring Serbia. So these are all the sort of things that the European Union is trying to persuade with this carrot of cash the countries of the Western Balkans to do. Keep things on side, make these little reforms that will bring you closer, if not within the accession process, then to enable the accession process. But it does seem interminable, Chris.
Well, and then to that point, I guess, of the interminable process, is there a way that you feel the EU can keep these countries on side without the European Union membership being that carrot at the very end? Is the money and the kind of other things they're offering right now enough for these countries to stay on the EU side?
I think the money can help a lot, and I think the war in Ukraine has helped a lot. It certainly made Serbia, despite everything you hear about Serbia having, sitting on the fence and keeping their friendships with Russia and China strong. The war in Ukraine has definitely given people in Belgrade pause for thought. And the European Union has seen, as the old saying goes, there's no crisis without an opportunity. And they've seen an opportunity here to push things on the funding front and say, look, there is concrete improvements in it for you now if you come along with us. And that can make a difference in people's infrastructure, physical infrastructure, in terms of the changes they're able to make in these important institutions that we've just been talking about. But it needs to have meaning, because I've seen this happen before in Cambodia, where I used to live and report, that you can spend a few hundred million pounds, euros, dollars in a place such as that, and then just see China come in and spend countless billions of dollars with no strings attached, and all of a sudden all your leverage is gone. So really the European Union should be moving more quickly and more decisively to, if it's really serious about including these countries in the bigger European project.
Guy Delany, Monocle's Balkans correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Let's get a roundup now of some of the day's business stories with Ewan Potts from Bloomberg. Ewan, we're going to start with a big European bank merger that is inching closer, UniCredit and Commerzbank. I remember covering this about 10 years ago. What have we learned now?
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, this one. Last week we found out that UniCredit, one of the two big banks in Italy, has amassed a 9% stake in Commerzbank, which is Germany's second biggest lender. It was a big deal for markets because these kind of cross-border bank tie-ups in Europe are really just so rare. Today, Bloomberg's learned that UniCredit is set to ask the ECB for permission to build a stake up to as much as 30%. Now, according to sources, the move doesn't necessarily mean the Italian company will buy all of those shares, but the approach to the ECB does edge the company closer to a full acquisition of Commerzbank, given that if it reached that level, it would be forced under German law to make a formal offer. Now, the UniCredit chief executive told Bloomberg last week that a full takeover of the German lender is an option, but he also left things a little bit open-ended, saying that selling the holding would be a possibility if the economics of the deal don't pan out. Now, regulators have been hoping for something like this for years. The concept of a European banking union was introduced back in 2012. The whole thing has really proved much trickier than anyone thought. And the EU banking market has really remained stubbornly operating in its own little national silos. So if all of this works out, it will really prove a much needed fillip to the concept of banking consolidation across the EU.
Well, that's what's interesting about this, Ewan, because I was in Frankfurt when that European banking union stuff was announced, and Commerzbank was always this target that was potentially muted to be one that might get taken over. Well, how do the Germans feel about that at this point?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's often the Germans doing the buying. It's incredible if you look back at the number of cross-border mergers across the banking industry over the last 20 years or so. It's really vanishingly thin. These things just don't happen. And Germany, which of course has focused so well on its manufacturing over the last few decades, although that is really causing them problems now, has a rather undeveloped banking sector. There are only two sizable banks listed on the German stock exchange, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank. So Germany really the kind of being pursued in this. Italy's banking sector is much more developed. It has two big, well-capitalized banks which are worth a lot of money. They're big players in European terms. And the Spanish also have a very big banking sector, and the French as well. Of course, that's before you even talk about the UK. But Germany's banking sector, something of a minnow, really, compared to the size of its economy.
Well, let's move on to one other story, Ewan. Talk of finding a deal between the world's two largest golf tournaments has been very tricky, particularly about the money.
Chris, yeah, there's trouble in the world of golf, and it's all about those poor, underpaid golfers, said no one ever. Now, it's over a year since the PGA Tour and the Saudi-backed Live Golf announced their shock tie-up. It's the new kid on the block. The Breakaway League has been in talks with the OG League now for over a year. You remember that the Saudi upstart lured a number of big-name players and sparked basically a massive punch-up between some of the big names in golf. But we understand, according to those according to those who endorsed this deal, it's money, which is the main sticking point. In the months leading up to the latest discussion, talks had failed about how to reintegrate the players that had ditched the PGA Tour to play for LIV and to ensure some kind of financial parity. Now, according to people who've been in the talks, a particular sticking point is Jon Rahm's LIV contract that was struck late last year, reportedly for $300 million. So apparently he's not happy to give up all of that cash. Some of the PGA Tour players want Rahm and some of the others who left to go to LIV Golf to hand back the money they've made from the Saudi tournament. Other options on the table included paying fines to participate in events or perhaps giving some of the money to charity. But apparently Rahm and the other LIV Golf players are refusing to agree to these terms. They say that it's unfair to penalise them for taking a risk and leaving the PGA Tour. So far, the whole business has not proved particularly successful for golf and its fans. The viewership of the PGA Tour has been falling and LIV has not really been picking up that slack. So the hope in the industry is that this tie-up will happen eventually.
Who would want to give away all that cash? Ewan Potts, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, the Booker Prize has released its shortlist of just 6 novels set to win the prestigious award, and who better to tell us more than Monocle presenter and host of Meet the Writers, Georgina Godwin. Georgina, great to have you on the show. Before we get to the nominees, you have been busy with your own brother's book launch. Is he a future winner?
Well, no, because it is non-fiction and the book is only Exit Wounds is a fantastic book. It's subtitled A Story of Love, Loss and Occasional Wars. And it came out on Thursday here in the UK. It's yet to come out in the US. But it's just been so wonderful kind of working on this and working towards a fantastic party. If anybody out there has a central place that they don't mind 300 of us, our closest friends, coming to take over one Friday night, I'm in the market for that. But it's a book that Dave Eggers called masterful, moving and unforgettable. And Philippe Sands said, a memoir of rare candor and intimacy, utterly compelling. Well, what I pick out from that is, of course, that the intimacy and the fact that it's a memoir does mean that it is about me and my life and our mother's life and my brother's life. So it's a very, very personal book for me. It really tells my story. And we're running a little competition. If you take a picture of yourself reading the book, and it's all over my socials, you can find out how to do it, then you can be a character in Peter's next book.
A character in Peter's next book. Okay, well, that's a good sign for how it's going so far.
There could be a hero called Chris Chermak in the next book. If you take a picture of yourself reading Exit Wounds.
All I have to do is take a picture of myself and I'm a hero. Amazing. Let's move on to the Booker Prize, shall we? Just because that is our topic for today. But very good luck to your brother with his launch. The Booker Prize, 5 women and 1 man nominated. Historic for the number of women nominated this year in 55 years of the Booker Prize. What have the women done right?
You know, I guess the quality of the writing just stood out. I mean, it is extraordinary that it is 5 women and just 1 man. The books are Orbital by Samantha Harvey, and she wants to write about the human occupation of low Earth orbit, but not as science fiction, as realism. And I think she's captured that really well. Rachel Kushner, of course, no stranger to prize lists with her book Creation Lake. And it's about a group of young people who decamp from Paris to a rural outpost in France. And she also looks at prehistory. It's a very, very interesting book. Anne Michaels wrote a book called Held, and she said, every day writing this book, I asked myself in these urgent times, what voice might be small enough to be heard? What do we need now? And that's exactly what she's achieved. She's found that voice. Stone Yard Devotional is by Charlotte Wood, and she said that comes out of elements of her own life and childhood, merging with an entirely invented story about an enclosed religious community. And she wrote it during the pandemic, so of course that gave her more of a kind of urgency to it. And then, of course, there is Safekeep, and that's by Yael van der Wouden.
Well, and that's one that we want to talk about particularly because this is the first time that the Netherlands has had a nominee for the Booker Prize. What took them so long?
Well, there has been a previous winner of the International Booker, but this was the first time that the Netherlands is on that list. It's also, interestingly enough, the only debut novel. And Yale teaches creative writing and comparative literature in the Netherlands, and she was raised trilingual. She wrote the Safekeep in English, which, of course, is one of the rules of the Booker Prize. It does have to be written in English. And it's just a really lovely book. It comes out of a short story she once wrote about 3 siblings out for dinner and the additional girlfriend that everyone hates. And I'm sure that's a situation that we're all familiar with.
Absolutely. Well, and Georgina, just to end, I mean, do you have a sense, if you did have to put money on it, who's the favourite to win?
You know, I'm afraid to say it's the only man on the list. It's James by Percival Everett. I interviewed him when he won the Bollinger Everyman Woodhouse Prize with his book The Trees, which was also shortlisted for the 2022 Booker. And that's a dark satire about America's history of racism. But this book is called James. Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is the source of the novel. And he is it's just luminous. It's a fantastic book. It's also the bookies' favourite to win. So if I was going to put money on it, I would say Percival Everett and James. And by the way, do listen to my interview with him on Meet the Writers.
We will absolutely do that. Do check out all of those books. And Georgina, just before you go, finally, what your brother's name and his book to remind listeners, because we're not, we don't mind a shameless plug here on Monocle Radio.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. It is Exit Wounds, a story of love, loss, and occasional wars, and it's by Peter Godwin.
That was Georgina Godwin. This is The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, right here in the British capital, London Fashion Week is turning 40 this year and is doing its best to make a splash amid an increasingly crowded calendar of cities vying to draw the fashion crowds away. Monocle's Grace Charlton has been hitting the runway shows, and she joins me now in studio. I will amend that from my menu that you're on the runway shows, not on the runway itself, Grace.
I was sitting, I wasn't walking down the catwalk, although it's sort of sweet that maybe you thought that. So
well, there we go, exactly. A compliment. How many shows have you seen?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. I think maybe 10.
10 shows.
Yeah.
And what was your favorite? Is there a favorite?
It's hard. I really liked Derek. He's a London-based designer, and his collection was inspired by the awful summer we've had in London. So it was like just raincoats and t-shirts, but with jumpers. Like, it was not at all like a summery celebration.
This feels like very much leaning into the British stereotype to do a show about raincoats.
Which is trendy at the moment. I don't know if you're on TikTok, Chris. I'm sort of assuming you might not be, but being British is quite cool at the moment. Like with Oasis and everything, it's actually quite a good calling card.
Okay, yeah. And leaning into the weather thing.
Exactly.
Like
yeah.
Fair enough. Which show did you miss that you would like to have seen?
Oh, I would have wanted. I did get an invite. Sorry, not to brag, to the Harris Reed show, but I wasn't able to go because I went to dinner, and it looked amazing. He used like 200-year-old wallpaper and tablecloths to make these incredible creations, and it looked amazing. But I had to admire from afar. And then the other big event that everyone talked about, which I also missed because I'm literally a grandmother, is Charlie XCX performing in Stratford. Do you know who that is?
This was the big one.
This was the hot ticket.
About. How did you miss that?
Again, I was at a dinner, and it's too far.
Oh, those dinners. Well, Grace, let's sort of zoom out a little bit. I wonder if you could give me sort of your best pitch for London Fashion Week over the Parises, the Milans, the Copenhagens, et cetera, of this world. It is 40 years of London Fashion Week. What sets it apart?
I think we have edge, we have spirit, we have like amazing fashion schools like Central St. Martin's and London College of Fashion. And we just have like this, we have all these really independent young designers who are not sleek like Chanel or Prada, and that's fine. They're like incredibly creative. They're so good at doing world building. So that I feel like people can be a little bit down on London and how it's maybe sort of ebbed and flowed in terms of its cultural relevance over the past 40 years. But I want to believe in it. I'm going to be an optimist. I think London's amazing.
And the London Fashion Week itself, is there something that it does where it has a strength that you would talk about?
Yeah, I think, again, it is just this like really sort of grittiness to being in London. And, you know, Copenhagen isn't gritty as a city, and that's great, and London is. So I think it's sort of like leaning into what you have. And London is so diverse, which is another huge strength. So like a lot of collections are by designers who tap into the heritage. So like Labrum, I went to that show yesterday at the Emirates Football Stadium, of all places, my first and only time visiting the Arsenal home. And like he taps into his heritage. He's from Sierra Leone. I saw Aluwalia, she's British, but also Indian and Nigerian. Like there's a lot more like cross-cultural conversations in London, I would say.
Well, just finally then, I mean, this was the 40th anniversary one. Do you feel that it can last beyond that? I mean, was it about this being sort of the 40-year anniversary? What will they come up with next year?
I mean, I'm sure it'll keep going. I hope so. I really hope London Fashion Week doesn't die. I think actually it does best when it's kind of back against a wall, because it is a hard time to be a fashion brand at the moment. A lot of independent brands are struggling. But, you know, we've been through this before. In the 90s, one of the best decades for London fashion was not particularly good financially. So, no, I think that we'll keep going. We'll keep the momentum. And, yeah, I think we'll just hopefully keep upping the ante. But it's okay. Like, things are cyclical.
Keep upping the ante for the next 40 years. Grace Charlton, thank you very much for joining us. And that is all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Laura Kramer. Our researcher was Gunnar Grunlid, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.